Hello and welcome to your Harrisburg Area Community College Blended Learning EMR program. Today's discussion is on your medical, ethical, and legal issue decisions as it relates to your practice as an EMR. First, laws differ from one location to the other, right? So EMR should learn the specific laws that apply in their state and local jurisdiction, right? So a lot of you, as part of a Harrisburg Area Community College program, will be Pennsylvania EMRs, but keep in mind, with your National Registry certification, you could function in multiple different states across the country, right? So you need to be aware of the fact that should you leave Pennsylvania, and in your practice in Pennsylvania, you're going to have an idea as to what specific laws apply to you. Don't lose sight of some general concepts, though. Above all else, do no harm, right? Regardless of what you do, it shouldn't harm anybody. That's pretty important, so don't lose sight of that core concept. Provide all care in good faith and provide proper and consistent care. Be compassionate and maintain your composure. It's going to make a difference for the patient in the long run. Duty to act. If you are employed by an agency as an EMR and dispatched to the scene of an accident or an illness, you have a duty to act. You must proceed quickly to the scene and provide emergency medical care within the limits and training of your available equipment. When it comes to that duty to act, failure to respond or render care necessary leaves you or your organization vulnerable to legal action, right? If you've got a duty to act, if you've got an obligation to provide care, you got to do it. You got to help somebody. And if you don't, it can really leave you personally and the organization you work for creates a liability for them as it relates to not providing that care, So we've got to provide it. The standard of care is the manner in which you must act or behave. You must meet two criteria. You got to treat the patient to the best of your ability, and you must provide care that's reasonable and prudent person with similar training would provide under similar circumstances, right? You must meet what is reasonable and common to do by people who are similar to you, right? Scope of care. Scope of care is another vocab term, and it's defined by the Department of Transportation's EMR educational standards, as well as medical protocols, standing orders, and online medical direction, right? So scope of care is, in Pennsylvania at least, is defined by the standing orders, the protocols, and the Department of Health scope of practice guidance. And we'll include that actually in your EMR chapter for this, so that you can see kind of what something like this might look like. Ethical responsibilities and competence. Ethical responsibilities. Treat a patient ethically means doing so in a manner that conforms to accepted professional standards or conduct. Stay up to date on skills and knowledge and review your performance and assess your techniques. Make sure to evaluate response times and try to follow up on patient outcomes. Take a patient continuing education programs or participate in quality improvement activities. Ethical behavior requires a couple of different things. One of the biggest things is true honesty. You've got to be honest in your care. You've got to be honest in your reports and never change that care or that report except to correct an error whenever you need to. Consent for treatment, right? Consent simply means giving approval or permission. Expressed consent, that's actual consent. That's when a person actually says to you that they're giving you consent for care, right? Verbally or non-verbally, that they're willing to accept treatment. Patient must be a legal age and able to make a rational decision. So an express consent is simply when you walk up to a patient and say, hey, my name is whoever, and I'm from the fire department, and I'm an EMR. Can I help you? And they go, yes. That is expressed consent, right? Now, when somebody gives express consent, they must be a legal age, must be able to make a rational decision when they do it. Now, implied consent, that's when a person doesn't specifically refuse care, right? And a lot of the times, implied consent is applied to people who are unconscious or maybe who have taken and drank too much alcohol or too much drugs and are altered in some way. These are people who haven't necessarily refused emergency care, but it's implied that they would want care because they're altered or unconscious in some way, right? Don't ever hesitate to treat an unconscious patient because they cannot provide definitive, actual consent. Also, consent for minors. Under the law, minors are not considered capable of speaking for themselves, right? So you should try to get consent from a parent before actually providing care. The challenge sometimes exists that you can't get a hold of mom, you can't get a hold of dad, you can't get a hold of aunt or uncle or grandparents. And in that circumstance where you can't get consent initially, and care is important, right? It is important that you provide that care without consent. Do not hesitate to give appropriate medical care if you can obtain actual consent, although it's important that we try to obtain consent initially. Consent of patients with mental illness. If the person appears to be a threat to themselves, to others, place this person under medical care. Know your state's legal mechanisms for handling these patients. Do not hesitate to involve law enforcement agencies wherever we can. A competent adult has a right to refuse care. Help the person understand the consequences by explaining to them the treatment that's appropriate, why they need that treatment, the potential risks of treatment if it's not provided, and any alternative treatments that might be helpful. There's a great section in your book about this. It's important that we get it right. Patient refusals should be documented on your patient care record according to agency protocols. Advanced directives. Advanced directives are documents that specifies what a person would want done if they're unable to make their own decisions, right? So an advanced directive would be, if your grandmother were to sign this document, if she would become incapacitated, unable to make her own decisions, who is in charge of her care? Who's in charge of making those decisions, right? A living will is drawn up by a patient, physician, and a lawyer states the type of medical care a patient wants or does not want in those circumstances. A durable power of attorney for healthcare allows a patient to designate another person to make decisions about care. A do not resuscitate order is a written request giving permission to medical personnel to withhold resuscitative efforts. All of these are vocab terms, right? And it's important that you really make sure you're clear on what each one is during the chapter. If you're unable to determine if an advanced directive is legally valid, begin care, right? Don't withhold care if you're not sure whether a directive is legally valid or not, right? In Pennsylvania, we do have something called a out-of-hospital medical directive. I'll make sure that we put copies on the actual D2L platform so that you guys can see what this post form might look like. Abandonment. Abandonment occurs when a trained person begins emergency care and then leaves the patient before another trained person takes over. Once you have started treatment, you must continue that care until a person with as much training arrives and takes over. People have died at a scene, right? You should see any signs that a person's alive. You should begin providing care. Do not assume a patient is dead unless one of the following conditions exists. Decapitation. Well, that makes sense. Decapitation, right? Rigor mortis, when a person is very rigid and they're stiff and they're hard. Tissue decomposition, right? As well as dependent lividity. And you'll see some pictures in your book as to what each one of those things are. If any of the signs of death are present, consider the patient to be dead. It's important to know your local, state, and regional protocols for dealing with patients who are dead at the scene, right? Be mindful of what those pictures look like. Negligence, right? Negligence occurs when a patient sustains further injury or harm because the care administered does not meet those standards. These conditions must be present. Things like duty to act, breach of duty, resulting injuries, and proximate cause. All vocab terms, be cognizant of what they mean and as how they relate to negligence itself. Confidentiality. Patient's information is confidential, right? Every information that we see on a call is confidential. Things like patient history, assessment findings, treatment provided, your communication with the patient, all is confidential. Information should be shared only with other medical personnel who are directly involved in that patient's care. In certain situations, you may release confidential communication to designated individuals. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996 strengthens a lot of the laws for protecting patients' information and making sure that that information remains confidential. Good Samaritan laws are protect citizens, not us as EMS professionals, as EMRs and EMTs, but Good Samaritan laws are designed to protect citizens for liability for errors and omission by giving good faith emergency care. They do vary so extraordinarily widely from state to state, right? They may no longer provide or be needed because they provide little or no legal protection from an EMS provider, right? They do a lot for our citizens, but they don't do a whole lot for us. Regulations. Be familiar with the federal, state, and local agency regulations that affect your job, right? Certification may be required to work as an EMR. You've got to maintain this certification over the use of continuing education or retesting every couple of years. You're responsible for maintaining that certification, right? That is a legal regulation that's obligatory. Reportable crimes, right? There are a couple of different areas where we may come across a case or call where we have to report that crime. Things like knife wounds, gunshot wounds, crashes, suspected elder and child abuse, domestic violence, dog bites, or rape. These are areas where we may have a legal obligation to report that crime to the police. Learn which crimes are reportable in your area. Know the procedures for reporting those crimes. Failure to do so could result in sanctions against you or your agency. Crime scene operations. Many emergency medical situations are also crime scenes. Keep these considerations in mind. You got to protect yourself. If you want to determine that a scene is unsafe, wait in a safe location until law enforcement personnel tell you the scene's safe. Your first priority is patient care. When you are assessing a scene, document anything that seems unusual. Move the patient only as necessary. Touch only what you need to touch to gain access to the patient. Preserve the crime scene for investigation and do not cut through knife or bullet holes in the patient's clothing because it can really mess up the police department's ability to do that crime scene investigation. Be careful where you place equipment. Keep non-essential equipment away. Work with appropriate law enforcement authorities on the scene and write a short report about the incident. Documentation, right? It's important that we document any account about a patient's condition and the care administered, but there are some certain circumstances where we've got to do a really good job. If those cases serve as a legal record of your treatment, they provide basis for evaluating the quality of the care that you're provided and should be clear, concise, accurate, and readable. And actually, it's something you can be called upon to have to testify about in court using that documentation. So it's important we get the documentation right. It should include things like condition of the patient when they're found, patient description of the injury or illness, any vital signs that you may have taken, treatment that you provided, and agency of personnel who took over that patient care, and any reportable conditions that are present. Documentation should also include any potential infectious disease exposures you might have come across and anything unusual regarding that situation. Bit of a summary on what we've talked about at this point. First, at an EMR, you do have a duty of act when you're dispatched, and we have to help when we're dispatched as part of our official duties, right? You should understand the differences between expressed implied consent, consent for minors, consent for patient with mental illness, and the right to refuse care. Make sure you're clear on what each one means. All of them are basically vocab terms, and we gotta get it right. Advanced directives give the patient the right to have care withheld, and it's important that we give them that right to have that care withheld in any circumstance where it's practically appropriate. You should understand the concept of abandonment, negligence, confidentiality, as well as the purpose of those Good Samaritan laws, right? We've got to know what they mean. And in certain events that deal with contagious diseases, abuse, or other illegal acts, we actually have an obligation to report those to legal authorities. Crime scene operations are complex. Be mindful of what you touch in those environments and document everything you possibly can. Your job is not complete until the paperwork's done, and understanding and following these concepts will really help you be a great EMR. This is just giving you a little bit of an overview on your chapter on medical, ethical, legal considerations on your practice as an EMR. Make sure you actually spend some time really focusing on the book. The vocab terms are vital for your success. Should you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please push that to your primary program coordinator. And as always, we appreciate your time, patience, and energy, and we look forward to seeing you at our next discussion. Have a great day.